And welcome to this installment of the Jess Usher Memorial Lecture Series. This lecture program is part of the ABAC Arts and Culture Series and is named for Dr. Jess Usher, a professor of history at ABAC that had a tremendous impact on his students, colleagues, and the community at large. It is in his honor that we have named this lecture series. In the film adaptation of King's Row, published by Henry Bellamann in 1940, the character of Colonel Skeffington spoke of the passing of Madame von Elm, quote, "When she passes, how much passes with her? A whole way of life, a way of gentleness and honor and dignity. These things are going, Henry, and they may never come back to this world," unquote. In the very same vein, this observation might be applied to Henry and Katherine Bellamann, who stood at the nexus of art and culture in pre-World War II Manhattan. Henry Bellamann authored King's Row and served as a founding faculty member of the Juilliard School. His wife, Katherine Bellamann, was president of the Mississippi Poetry Society. She was also president of the Magnolia branch of the National League of American Pen Women in Mississippi. Some of her poems may be found in Lyrics and Different, two works published by the Mississippi Poetry Society. About our speaker tonight, Dr. Rachael Price is an associate professor of English at Abraham Baldwin Agricultural College, where she is also the director of the college's literary magazine, Pegasus, and ABAC's own student-staffed undergraduate teaching press, Horseman Press. She holds a PhD in American Literature from the University of Arkansas, and her scholarly work has been published in Mid-America, the North Carolina Literary Review, and Contemporary Literary Criticism, as well as Critical Regionalism, 20th Century and Contemporary American Literature in Context, and Campus Conversations, Student Success Pedagogies in Practice. She has also published short fiction and travel writing pieces in a variety of journals during her career. Just last year, she received the prestigious W. Bruce and Rosalind Ray Donaldson Award for Teaching Excellence at ABAC. She lives in Tifton with her husband, Chris, and their daughter, Verity. At this point, ladies and gentlemen, I invoke a point of personal privilege and invite a local blogger and newspaper publisher to finish this introduction. Having extensive, direct personal knowledge of our speaker tonight, I can think of no one better equipped to bring our featured speaker to the stage. Miss Verity.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. The lovely lady who is going to come and talk about and tell you about King's Row is my mom, and she always told me a few things about public speaking: not to fidget, not to say and speak loud and proud. I think that she will do a very good job being an example for those few things. But she has worked so hard for this, and I hope you enjoy. Welcome, Rachael Price. Thank you.
Wow, I was not expecting that. They planned that on their own, so that was very nice. I can't promise that I won't fidget. I can't promise that, I will be loud and proud, but I can't promise I won't fidget. I can't promise I won't say I'm going to talk slowly because I have a tendency to talk really quickly. So I want to get started. And again, I want to thank everyone. I'm thankful for being here. And again, we're here because of the memory of Jess Usher, who is a dear friend of mine. And I know there are some jokes in this presentation he would really like. So I'm here to talk about Henry and Katherine Bellamann. And as you can see, the title of this presentation is The Forgotten, quote, Power Couple of World War II America. I'm wondering if I should adjust the lights a little bit. Yes. Is it possible to bring maybe if I do the lights in the back, turn off the lights backstage? Okay, hold on a minute. Talk amongst yourselves. Yeah. Do we have someone checking on the lights? Oh, awesome, thank you. In the meantime, also, I will just say that my extra credit sign-up sheet is outside, and we do also have some books for sale by Horseman Press, which I'll talk more about later, but yes, I am giving extra credit. I'm happy to see people have come out. I know it's a very busy time of the semester, and I know that tonight is the first night of the ABAC truck and tractor pull. So I really appreciate your coming out tonight. My husband actually said that he thought maybe I should just get a tent at the tractor pull and just give my speech over megaphone, which I'm really tempted to do, but we will work on this. Okay, so as we are working on the lights, I just want to give a little bit of background. As you can see, I gave this talk the title, The Forgotten Quote, Power Couple of World War II America. And by the way, if you've had me in class before, yes, I'm using quotation marks correctly there, just so you know, because I'm kind of invoking a term that has become very popular in the 21st century to people in the 1930s and 40s when this was really not as much of an idea, the idea of a power couple. And so really what I'm hoping to accomplish through this talk is to introduce you to Henry and Katherine Bellamann and to explain to you why we should care. Like, why do we need to care about what happened to this couple who lived a long time ago? Why have we never heard of them? Well, I'm going to talk about a little bit why we've never heard of them, why they've been forgotten, and what we can do to remedy that. Gosh, I'm trying to think how I can make my visuals. Okay. Oh, that's turning the house lights up. It's something. Yeah, it goes the opposite direction. Yay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Okay, so a word of warning. Spoilers ahead for some stories that were written almost 100 years ago, but just in case, I still think obviously it's worth reading some of the material, especially King's Row, like you've already heard about. See, I said It's very important there's a lot you can say with King's Row, even if you know what's going to happen, because there's so much in that book, but we're going to talk about what's going to happen. So, just FYI. I don't think you'll be too disappointed, because this book was written, it was published in 1940, and it's about 600 pages long. So there's plenty, if you're really interested, to look at, even though we're going to spoil some things today. By the way, this presentation starts out with a big focus on King's Row, because my introduction to the Bellamanns really kind of came along through King's Row. But it goes way beyond that, as you'll see. But in the beginning, I want to talk about King's Row, because most people, if they have heard of either Henry or Katherine Bellamann, it is through King's Row. Another thing is content warning. So, we're not going to be talking about things that are really obscene or anything, but we're going to be dealing with some mature content. It's not that bad, as you can see. My 11-year-old is here, but we have to be mature adults. We're going to talk about, there's sex and violence and all kinds of things. These are very much, King's Row is considered a very scandalous and salacious novel in its day, so there is definitely going to be some controversial content we'll talk about. Okay, so I want to start by explaining how I became interested in this huge tome that was published so many years ago. So not only was it published in 1940, but it starts in the year 1890, so this is like some old stuff. Well, my first introduction, like many people, came through the movie, and this was about 2010, and it was my first semester in my doctoral program, and I was taking 2 classes, teaching 2 classes, still working 20 hours a week remotely as an editor, and I was pretty exhausted. Of course, a couple years later, I had a baby, and I added another level of exhaustion to it, but I used to just kind of I would be working up late, I would be burning the midnight oil, and I would just kind of pass out sometimes in front of the TV, and I woke up from one of these studying stupors, and this scene was on the TV, and I'm just going to, without any further context, I'm just going to show you this scene from the movie King's Row, because this is probably the most famous scene from King's Row. it was one of those moments where I thought, what did I just watch? And by the way, I think you will be able, at least most of you will be able to identify one of the actors. So obviously, he is not having the best day. So does anyone know who that actor is? Ronald Reagan, that's right. Former President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, in what is considered to be his finest role, that of Drake McHugh in King's Row. So I don't know, could you hear what he said? He said, "Where's the rest of me?" So he literally wakes up to find he has no legs. He works on the railroad. He has been in a horrible accident. He's in a coma. He wakes up and he has no legs. So obviously he is not having the best day. By the way, come to find out, his legs have been unnecessarily amputated by the evil town doctor who likes to do evil things to people. They didn't need to be amputated. So he wakes up, and I saw that, and I thought, what is going on? And I felt like I just had to know more of the story. Incidentally, Ronald Reagan also considered this his finest role. This was his favorite role he ever played. And no joke, I'm not kidding, folks. He was so taken with the role that he named his 1968 autobiography, "Where's the Rest of Me?" True story. So make of that what you will, I'm not sure. So that was my introduction to King's Row. And I thought, what is this movie? And this is just a small slice of the small town of King's Row at the turn of the 20th century that you see. So that was my introduction. But in order to talk about King's Row and how it came about and why it's important, of course, we have to talk about its author, Henry Bellamann. So as you can see, this is a nice photo of Henry Bellamann in 1905, when he was 23 years old. And in his younger days, this photo, by the way, is courtesy of the Kingdom of Callaway Historical Society. So as you can see, he was born in Fulton, Missouri on April 28, 1882. Fulton is a small town, a little smaller than Tifton size, I would say. I think there are something like 12,000 people in Fulton. I had a really wonderful experience last year. So as you can see, I helped bring King's Row back into print, which was a dream come true of mine, which, by the way, it was published by Hastings College Press. Horseman Press, our own press, we publish works in the public domain, but King's Row was not actually in the public domain because it was published in 1940, and I had to go on a wild goose chase for the copyright that lasted a very long time. But I finally was able to get the copyright, and I went to Fulton, and I gave a presentation for their historical society, and it was so cool, because it was like, not only did I get to bring my favorite book back into print, but there were all these people talking to me about how, to this day, they said, oh, you know, my grandmother said I should never read King's Row. That's a horrible book, but your talk really changed my mind, and I thought, oh, that was so cool. That was just like a dream come true. So Fulton, Missouri is where he is from, and by the way, Fulton basically is King's Row. Like, Henry Bellamann never said that, but there's been some good research done to show that it is King's Row. And he had kind of a rough start in his hometown. So he was rumored to be illegitimate. His parents got married when his mother was 5 months pregnant, which was kind of scandalous in 1882. His siblings were much younger than he was, and some people said that his father was not his biological father, that his parents got married to heir him a sense of legitimacy, to give him a name. And so he kind of grew up literally on the outskirts of town. He was raised, his parents had a lot of problems. He was raised mostly by his elderly grandmother, and they literally lived like at the edge of town. You have to kind of, if you go there and see it, you have to kind of cross the railroad tracks. So he literally grew up having this experience of not quite fitting in with the hometown. So he went to Westminster College, which is actually in Fulton, Missouri, and I gave a talk there too, and that was so cool. And he did a year at Westminster College before he went away. Now, a few interesting things about Henry Bellamann's education. So the first thing, he did a year at Westminster College. I went to Westminster College, and they gave me a file of basically his records when he was at Westminster College, including his grades. So I guess they did not have FERPA back then, or it doesn't apply after a certain amount of time. I don't know, but I got to look at his grades, and his grades were not great. And here's where it gets crazy. See how I have the University of Denver, question mark. He always said he went to the University of Denver. Well, another Bellamann researcher, and there are not very many of us, so we know each other pretty well. His name is Harry Bain, and he recently retired from Spartanburg Methodist College in Spartanburg, South Carolina. He has devoted his whole life to researching Henry Bellamann. He wrote his dissertation on Henry Bellamann at Ole Miss back in the 80s. And he basically has never found any evidence that not only did he not graduate from the University of Denver, but that he ever attended, or that he ever attended any other college besides Westminster, which of course is not bad in and of itself, but here's where it gets crazy. He made a living as a music professor at colleges, being called Dr. Bellamann, telling people he had a PhD. He literally was just faking it his whole life, which I don't know if that's horrible or awesome. Like, I don't know. But he held, at prestigious schools. He taught at Vassar. He was one of the first deans at Juilliard, at the Juilliard School of Music. He taught at the Curtis Institute of Philadelphia. He had all these prestigious positions, and everyone called him Dr. Bellamann. In fact, even his own wife referred to him posthumously all the time as her husband, Dr. Bellamann. He was not a doctor at all, so make with that of you will. He married his wife, Katherine, in 1907, which I'm going to talk more about later because she is an important part of the picture. And he was a musician first, and his main career was being a musician. He was friends with a lot of famous musicians, but he also was writing for a long time. He did not really become famous as a writer until Kings Row, but he was always a writer. He wrote a weekly column for the paper The State in Columbia, South Carolina. He spent a long time living in South Carolina because he and his wife were teaching at Chicora College, which was a women's college in Columbia back then. And he wrote a literature review column. So that was kind of interesting. And next slide, please. There we go. This is Henry as an older man. This is kind of more how, if you were to look up Henry Bellamann, you would probably see this picture, this older, stern version of Henry Bellamann around the time he got famous. So starting in 1926, he tried his hand at novels. And we actually have his first novel on sale, Pettinera's Daughter, if you're interested, through Horseman Press. And that was published in 1926. And Pettinera's Daughter, so first of all, Pettinera's Daughter, Kings Row, and Floods of Spring all take place in this same small rural area of Missouri, and there are a lot of events and characters that kind of overlap. It's kind of like the Bellamann multiverse. Pettinera's Daughter is about a poor farm girl who gets pregnant out of wedlock, and basically her baby daddy just up and leaves her, and kind of how she and the community deal with that, which was not an easy thing in 1926. And actually he's writing about an era about a generation before. So even less easy. His next novel, Crescendo, is his New York novel, and it is about kind of a thinly disguised version of Bellamann himself as a musician in New York, caught in a love triangle. We'll talk more about that later. The Richest Woman in Town is also a small town novel, and it is about a woman who became the richest woman in town. How do I put this delicately? A lot of men. There were a lot of men who kind of helped her become the richest woman in town. And when I was in Fulton, I was floored because there was some guy who came to both of my talks, and he said that he knew someone who knew Bellamann, and he insisted that this person had said that Bellamann based this idea of the richest woman in town on his own grandmother, which I think is kind of crazy to write a novel about how your own grandmother basically slept with a bunch of guys and got a bunch of money, but hey, if it works. His next novel was a gothic thriller set in South Carolina called The Gray Man Walks. Of course, we have Kings Row in 1940, Floods of Spring in 1942, and Victoria Grandelet in 1944, which was another kind of a mystery novel set in the South. And then, as you can see, his output stops abruptly because he died in 1945. So, a little bit of background about Kings Row and why it's important. Some of you, if you've had me in class before, may have heard me talk about the movement called the Revolt from the Village. So in 1915, Carl Van Doren famously wrote in an article for The Nation about this movement that he called the Revolt from the Village. And what he meant was, like, America has always prided itself on these small towns, right? We have the pastoral, we have nature, we have farms, we have all this great stuff, like all the evil, all the sin, all that stuff, that's in the cities. That's not in the small towns. And the revolt from the village was like, hey, actually that stuff happens in small towns too. And a lot of these books were considered super controversial because they dared to kind of talk about the other side of small town America. So there's the Spoon River Anthology by Edgar Lee Masters, which is a book of poems written by the inhabitants of this town called Spoon River. And what's interesting is there are a series of kind of first-person poems written by all the people in this cemetery. So it's basically like these people had to wait until they were in their grave to say what they really thought about the other people in town. And then you see the same kind of thing in short story form in a series of interrelated short stories called Winesburg, Ohio by Sherwood Anderson in 1920. And then in 1921, we see the kind of the third really famous revolt from the village text is Main Street by Sinclair Lewis, which, by the way, if you have not read Sinclair Lewis, he is one of my favorites because he's a very cynical person. And I think that Sinclair Lewis's cynical take on American society, I don't know if this is good or bad, but in a lot of ways it's just like just as spot on in 2023 as it was in 1923. I don't know. I love Sinclair Lewis. Okay, so you can see here, this is an article from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. And this is in 1940 when Kings Row was exploding in popularity. And so you can see it says Missouri author and his disputed bestseller. And of course, Fulton is about an hour and a half away from St. Louis. So this is a fairly local story. And it says, Henry Bellamann insists town of Kings Row does not exist. Try to tell that in Fulton. So again, Henry Bellamann always insisted this isn't autobiographical, but there's a lot of evidence that it was based on events in Fulton and people in Fulton. And I'm just going to read the first couple of paragraphs of this article because it cracks me up. Okay, it says, there are some unpleasant characters in Kings Row, that novel of life in a small Missouri town near St. Louis that has entered the 6th printing since it was published last April. And many people in and around Fulton, Missouri, where the author Henry Bellamann spent his early years, suspect they recognize some of the town's families. Some are indignant and some are pleased, but most with an opinion on the subject are resentful. Now, this quotation here is my favorite. One half of the town is angry because they think they see themselves in Kings Row, wrote Bellamann's sister Elizabeth, still a music teacher at Fulton. The other half is angry because they were left out. Which I just think that's very funny and very true of humans. The author's mother, Mrs. Caroline Bellamann, also lives in Fulton. And it's talking about, basically this article is about like, is it Fulton, is it not? By the way, this picture is just a nice little picture. These aren't people in the book or anything, it's just a little drawing they put in the paper. But it was really controversial, is this Fulton? And of course, a lot of people thought it was Fulton and were very resentful, as I saw literally 80 years later coming back to Fulton and still hearing people say that their parents and grandparents told them never to read that awful book. But Henry Bellamann also used to get a lot of letters, and he said that he got so many letters where people said they knew where Kings Row was, and it was always their town. Like it was, so they weren't like, oh, it's Fulton, Missouri, because there's elements of that I think we all recognize. No small town is perfect, and that's one of the ideas he was trying to put forth. So the novel itself had a very salacious reputation because of the content, which we're going to talk about more. But here's what's interesting is I think when you look at a book like this in 2023, and I think in some ways Kings Row and a lot of other works were done a disservice by this kind of attitude. So it was seen as very salacious and even trashy, which was very helpful for book sales because people wanted to read it. People wanted to know what kind of smutty things were happening in Kings Row. But it kind of hindered its staying power, right? Because it was kind of considered like pulpy, wasn't considered to have any literary value. I think when you look at a novel like this in 2023, you think it's not even so much that it's scandalous, it's like he's just saying like these are real issues, and these are real things that people in small town America are dealing with. And it's not really, by today's standards, it is not handled sensationally at all. In both the book and the movie, there are some parts of the book that are pretty explicit, but there are other parts, and again, the movie, I want to talk about the movie. They always use buggy riding as a euphemism for sex, just so you know, buggy riding, going out buggy riding. So I have a couple quotes here to kind of illustrate the point I'm trying to make. Dr. J. Miles Carr, who is a scholar who brought King's Row back into print in 1980 and did a lot of work on King's Row. He says that King's Row is a novel with a humanitarian social purpose behind it. The quintessential point of the whole complex example is social tolerance. So I think reading it today, it's not so much like, oh my gosh, look at these crazy people. It's like, look, these are real people with real problems, just like the rest of America. The New York Times review in 1940, Harold Strauss said, the publishers say that the theme is the hatred of nonconformity and that the town of King's Row brutally crushes and throws aside those who do not measure down to its warped standards. But half a dozen characters live in bold and admitted nonconformity, which is very true. So what I say here is a contemporary reading reveals a sensitive portrayal of a small town and real issues of the day as they affected the citizens of King's Row, particularly the outsiders and the most marginalized voices in the community. Okay, so I'm going to move on from King's Row eventually, but I want to talk about a few more things because it's just, again, it is my favorite. So the timeline, it takes place over a broad swath of time, which, by the way, as we're going to talk about, was part of the problem with the movie, casting for the movie. It takes place over 20 years, from about 1890 until about 1910. Now, 1890, according to the meeting of the U.S. Census in 1890, they declared that year the death of the frontier, meaning that America had always considered itself this place that had these wide open spaces, and there was always this frontier to explore. You could always go west. You could have free land. You could start over. You could have a little elbow room, right? That's one of the great things, manifest destiny, all that stuff. Well, in 1890, the U.S. Census decided that basically settlement had expanded as far west as it could, and there really was no more frontier, mythical or otherwise, to look forward to. So he's really dealing with this time of like, okay, we're in the Midwest, we're in this time of expansion, but the expansion's kind of stopped. What do we do with ourselves now, right? And I think the Midwestern locale is very important. And I mentioned here a note I said compare with the American South, because I think living here in the South, you're constantly aware that you live in the South, of the South as a region, right? And all that that entails. But the Midwest is kind of the opposite. Like the Midwest kind of stands in for America as a whole. It's kind of, I do an exercise in my American Lit class where we map the regions of America, and we kind of talk about the different stereotypes of these regions. And the Midwest is always like flyover country, corn, and I mean, they're not wrong. So my husband is from Nebraska, and if you've ever driven through Nebraska, you will understand why Willa Cather, in her first chapter, My Antonia, said the only thing that you can say about Nebraska is that it was still, all day long, Nebraska. So there's something to that. So, and Henry Bellamann, this is a note I found in his papers. All of his papers, his and his wife's, are in about 25 boxes at special collections at the University of Mississippi. And I got to go through all of them, and it was so cool. I love this stuff. And he said, in a handwritten note I found, he said, King's Row, quote, is in its basic structure the story of a town in the Middle West, covering a period of significant change when such towns lost their individual character with the disappearance of the second wave pioneers and merged into standardized imitations of small cities with the consequent loss of much that made them interesting. So when we look at the, quote, revolt from the village, a lot of people were offended because they thought, you're criticizing our values, you're criticizing our way of life, you're saying it's not good to live in a small town. And what he's really saying here, he's like, no, in some ways the problem with King's Row is that it's not small town enough. It's going through this weird thing where it's not what it used to be. It's just kind of trying to be like everybody else, right? It's like, nowadays, Fulton, it is kind of like everywhere else. It has the chain, all the big box stores, all that stuff. So here's the opening lines of King's Row, which I just think right away sets up this kind of tension that Henry Bellamann is talking about. It says, spring came late in the year 1890, so it came more violently, and the fullness of its burgeoning heightened the seasonal disturbance that made unquiet in the blood. The green distances of the lands were gashed and scarred with wandering roads, lumpy and deep-rutted for the heavy wheels that had groaned and strained through the winter mud. These roads came from the outlying regions, springing up like casual streams, marking themselves more and more deeply in the soil as they moved between rail fences, widening as they wound toward the county seat. So this is very interesting to me because we have this kind of pastoral nature scene but it's very violent, right? There's like unquiet in the blood, and there's ruts and gashes and groaning and straining, and it's setting up this tension right away of this idea of the perfect pastoral small town. Okay, so in addressing the novel King's Row, of course, I have to address the movie King's Row. And so, if the technology gods will allow it to be so, I'm going to play for you the theme from King's Row, because King's Row, at the time the movie came out in 1942, was famous for its score by a famous composer named Erich Korngold. And I am going to play this for you, and I want you to kind of listen and see if anything sounds familiar, especially the first 5 notes. But again, let's hope this works. I'm going to cross my fingers. Watch on YouTube. Fine, I'll watch it on YouTube. That works. Okay, here we go. Oh, an ad. Okay.
Grammarly Business features the same premium writing suggestions
ad for
millions of
Grammarly?
individuals know and love from Grammarly. Grammarly Business extends the
You
premium
know, I was telling my
experience
students
across your
just today how can you really trust a grammar engine that is named after the adverb, which is the worst part of speech. Come on. Okay, so I'm going to play this bit and listen to see if it sounds familiar, especially the first 5 notes. What are those? It's Star Wars, yes. So, Erich Korngold, the composer of King's Row, he had a young composer who worked with him at the time, whose name was John Williams, who you may know as the composer of Star Wars and many other movie scores. So, I just think this is interesting. Now, I am not a person, far be it for me to have the authority to say someone's plagiarizing, but you can definitely hear the influence, let's say, definitely. And I just think that's really striking because the Star Wars theme is so iconic. Those opening notes are so iconic. But he didn't actually come up with those himself. Now, did he actually plagiarize? My guess is that he probably kind of unintentionally plagiarized because he had worked with Korngold. I'm sure he had all kinds of things in his head. But there's also, I'm going to skip forward a little bit, and you'll hear some of the incidental music is a little similar too. Well, we will speed ahead, but there's an incidental song in King's Row that's also very similar to Star Wars. I won't pain you by singing it, but I will encourage you to look it up, because if you go to YouTube, you see all kinds of things, like the similarity between the King's Row soundtrack and the Star Wars soundtrack. It's pretty clear, let's just put it that way. So that's just something that I think is interesting, and that is probably one of, aside from Ronald Reagan, probably the most lasting legacy of the film is the use of those first 5 notes in Star Wars. So, okay, back to my PowerPoint. There we go. Okay. So, really quickly, because I don't want to talk about just King's Row the whole time, but I want to talk about how he kind of talks about, part of why it was so controversial is because he talks about this town through the outsiders. And these 5 characters, they start as children. They're about 12 in the beginning, and they grow all the way into adulthood. And this story follows them. And by the way, that was part of why they had a really hard time casting the movie, because let me just show you, well, I'll show you in a second, but there were a lot of problems with the movie, as we're going to discuss. So here, I have some pictures from the movie, but I don't even have a picture of Jamie Wakefield, because Jamie Wakefield was, as Bellamann called him in his handwritten notes, a, quote, born homosexual. And so this movie came out in 1942. And what set of rules was the MPAA operating under at this time? If any of you have heard of the Hays Code, that was a really big thing at this time. So the Hays Code was kind of a set of provisos that the MPAA followed starting in about 1934. And it basically came from the Catholic Church. And it was basically a push to make films decent. And because believe it or not, if you watch stuff from pre-Hays Code, the 1920s and 30s, they were going wild. I mean, like, people always think like in the olden days, things were always so much more calm, and no, like 1920s movies, some of them are crazy. The Hays Code had a lot of ideas for what you could and couldn't show, including things that were considered very controversial. So to me, it's, by today's standards, I think it's actually really kind of insulting that they're like, well, we can't show a queer character, but we can keep in the abusive father who murders his own daughter. We can keep in the town doctor who amputates people's legs. I mean, but they couldn't, the character of Jamie Wakefield was considered too controversial. Incidentally, another thing about the Hays Code is they had rules about how movies could end. So characters, especially if they were good people, their endings couldn't be too bad. So, which is part of why if you see the King's Row movie, spoiler alert, at the end, the movie is much happier than the book. At the end, the Ronald Reagan character is just kind of like, oh, well, my legs are gone, but I have hope and everything's going to be great. And it's like, it's important to have a good attitude, but it's not necessarily the most realistic portrayal of what he goes through in the book. Okay, Cassie Tower. Cassie Tower's story was also censored. As you can see here, she was played by Betty Fields. All of these people are way too old for their characters, just so you know. So Betty Fields, and the way she is played in the movie drives me nuts, because this is the look she has on her face the whole movie. She's always scared, and she's always kind of running away from things, and her story was censored such that she doesn't make sense. So in the book, it talks about how she's the prettiest girl in town, but she's very secretive. And she has this father, Dr. Tower, and he has this unnamed wife who spends much of the novel in an apparently catatonic state before her mysterious death, just like sitting in the window, her mother. And Cassie is very isolated by her father. He actually, when she gets to be about 12, he takes her out of school, and she really is not allowed to go anywhere or do anything or have any freedom. She begins a relationship with Paris during this time, a secret relationship. And Paris refers to her as a, quote, nymphomaniac, which is not really a term we use anymore, but Bellamann was big on Freudianism. But what's really tragic about Cassie's story is she was a victim of child sexual abuse. So, but the Hays Code said you can't show that. So, I mean, you can't address that storyline. So they just made her murder because she was her father killed her because she was very fearful and, quote, insane. Which to me is really kind of insulting and almost makes her look like the bad guy, and she's not the bad guy. She had a horrible abuser father who killed her in a murder-suicide, who had been molesting her. So, and one of the things is, again, people thought that was really trashy, but if you read the novel, I feel like that's actually a really, I mean, it's a delicate subject, but it's a very sensitive portrayal that, like, hey, these things really happen, even in small-town America. We need to address them, because just pretending they don't exist isn't going to make the problem any better. So I'm going to kind of skip through. This is the protagonist, Paris Mitchell, played by Robert Cummings, who is way too old to be playing. He's supposed to be a teenager. But they wanted to have Tyrone Power, but Tyrone Power, so this was Warner Brothers. MGM would not lend him out. And the character of Randy Monahan, who is Drake McHugh's girlfriend. Of course, Drake McHugh is the Ronald Reagan character, and Drake McHugh is seen as this almost hyper-masculine kind of character. He's got, like, girls everywhere. He has a lot of money. He goes through a very dramatic reversal of fortune after the local bank steals all his money. The banker just, back then, he just steals all his money and goes to Brazil and has to kind of deal with that. So, I've talked a lot about King's Row and why it's important nowadays. I want to give a shout out to, this is actually my friend Lenny Pinna, who is also, again, we're our very tiny Bellamann Club. He just came out with this book. It has kind of an intriguing title. It's called A Face from Uranus. It's talking about Uranus, the planet. But this is a really good collection of, there was a young queer man who wrote to Henry Bellamann then in the 1940s. And it reads like a diary, because he said, Mr. Bellamann, you're the only person I feel like I can be myself to. So it's a collection of their letters. But I must move on, if my PowerPoint will let me. There we go. Okay, so bottom line, I think that King's Row in the current time teaches us that these differences are important, right? That it's all about the idea of the outsider. And I think in order to really appreciate Kings Row, you have to know that he's saying, like, I don't hate this town, but we need to embrace the whole town, even those who don't necessarily fit in. Now, Katherine, okay? So for a long time, Katherine was Henry's wife. For a long time, I was not really that into Katherine because I thought Henry's the author of this book that I love and some other books that I don't necessarily love, but they're pretty good. But I did not know much about Katherine. I knew that she was also a musician. I knew that she was also a writer. But the more research I've done, the more I realize how important Katherine is and how she doesn't really get credit for a lot of things that she did. So she was actually older than her husband. She was born in 1877 in Mississippi, and she actually was his student at music college. They got married, and then they moved to South Carolina, where they taught at Chicora for a long time. And then she became a vocal coach when they moved to New York. It's cut off, but this picture of her is from the state newspaper in Columbia, South Carolina, 1925, and the headline is about how Miss Bellamann is moving her studio to New York. But she was also a writer, and she was also a novelist. And I started reading her stuff, and I was blown away. So first of all, her first novel that actually came out long before Kings Row was a book called My Husband's Friends. And My Husband's Friends is basically my husband's affairs. It is basically a very thinly disguised book about her experiences with Henry Bellamann and his affairs. And you don't see a lot of books like that from a woman's perspective during that time, kind of talking about all the frustration she went through. It's very thinly disguised. For example, her husband is a famous scientist, but he's unlike any scientist I've ever seen because he hangs out with all these musicians and actors and famous people. I don't know, he's like Stephen Hawking at Studio 54. I don't know. He has all these famous friends and all these glamorous people around him, and he's surrounded by young women that he's having affairs with. And this is written from her perspective about what you can obviously see as the pain and frustration, but that couldn't necessarily be voiced. In 1931, the idea was you had to stand by your man, right? And it's actually it's scandalous because if you know as much as I do about the Bellamans, you know who's who, and you're like, oh my goodness. But it's very touching and very moving. And she actually, her husband kind of got the credit for being the big author. She wrote this 9 years before Kings Row, and actually this was a much bigger seller than any of his books until Kings Row in 1940. So Henry Bellamann, I think I mentioned, died suddenly in 1945. And in 1948, she published Paris Mitchell of Kings Row, which is the sequel to Kings Row. Now, there's a little bit of controversy because we all know sequels, right? The only sequel that's better than the original is The Godfather Part 2, and you won't change my mind about that. But what's interesting is her husband had died, and the publisher wanted this book to be finished, so she finished it. And I actually just want to read a little bit about how she finished this book, because I think it says a lot about their relationships. Because yes, even though it looks like, Henry Bellamann, there's very strong evidence that he had a lot of affairs. They also had this very kind of synergistic relationship. But again, I think a lot of times her role in the relationship was overlooked as the woman. So in the preface to Paris Mitchell of Kings Row, Katherine wrote, Henry Bellamann's method of work was an unusual one. We talked stories out in minutest detail, and he rarely wrote a line unless I was in the room with him. By the way, she also typed all of his stuff, which, let me tell you, when I was at the archives at Ole Miss, he wrote the first Kings Row all by hand in cursive, and she typed the whole thing 3 more times, 3 more drafts. So that's dedication right there. He never at any time wrote a scene that had not been clearly rehearsed, and after it was written, he never revised a passage. Any revision or cutting or editing fell to my lot, which again, it's kind of like, wait a second, who should be getting the credit here? This doesn't seem quite fair. For that reason, the characters created were my constant companions as well as his. They did not always act as we expected. They often went their own way, sometimes to our dismay, but by the time a story was written, we both knew the characters intimately. I have often wondered how it was possible for two writers of totally different background and training to collaborate successfully on a story, yet it has been done often. However, I wish to explain that my husband and I were married young, and most of our training was obtained together. For nearly 40 years, we read the same books, studied the same music, saw the same pictures, knew the same people, and had the same hobbies. During all that time, we were seldom separated for a week at a time. When he taught piano, I taught singing in a studio not more than 20 feet away from his own. When he worked on the translation of the Brahms song text for a French publisher, I sat across the table and wrote a novel, My Husband's Friends. By the way, another interview with her I read said that part of the reason she wrote My Husband's Friends is because when Henry was working on this translation, he wanted, he was kind of a little bit of a dictator. He wanted complete quiet in the apartment. So she couldn't play her piano, so she was bored. So she's like, I guess I'll write a novel about you and your affairs, which is kind of funny. During all that time, we were seldom separated for a week at a time. I just read that. When he reviewed books for a literary page, which he did for many years, I looked over each week's accumulation of volumes, eliminated those of less importance, and read with him those he needed to review. It is not strange our tastes and ideas should have followed parallel lines. So it's not just this. I won't. If you want to ask me more, I will, but there's a lot of evidence that Katherine really was kind of a co-author in a lot of ways. But I want to move on. And by the way, she also moved back to Jackson, Mississippi. She was originally from Mississippi after he died and had an amazing life. She was so active. Like, if you look at the papers from that time, she was doing something every day. And she was a founding member of the Mississippi Poetry Society, which is the most active poetry society I've ever seen. They had so much going on. It was so cool. But I want to talk about her life as a vocal coach in New York. And first I want to there we go. Okay. So she and Henry, at the peak of their careers, they lived at this building, the Ansonia Hotel, which I'm going to talk about in a second. But I'm going to pull this up on my phone and just read it, because this is so good. This is so good. So Katherine Bellamann worked as a vocal coach in New York City, and she had so many famous students who took their lessons in the Bellamann's apartment in the Ansonia. And one of her students, so I think personally probably her two most famous students, Barbara Streisand was her student, so that's pretty cool, and also Desi Arnaz. So I'm going to read to you a couple stories. This is actually from the archives at Ole Miss, and actually I spent so many, unfortunately, years ago when I was in the archives, I spent all this time on Henry. Well, my friend Lenny actually found these notes from Katherine. These are for a talk she gave at a local women's club in Mississippi in the 1950s after Henry had died about her experience as a vocal coach. And I want to read you a couple little anecdotes about Desi Arnaz, because they're so great. It says, I had many interesting students, my clientele being largely a Broadway one, made up of theatrical aspirants and dancers who wished also to sing well enough to be in musical comedies. They worked hard and on the whole were serious-minded about their work. All that is except Desi Arnaz, who was probably the laziest student I ever had in my studio. And look where he is now. And this next one's even better. This is another story she gave about Desi. And, okay, there we go. I've got old eyes. Okay. So she said, there was one morning I remember when Desi Arnaz, presently of the I Love Lucy show, came into the studio, not for a lesson, oh no, but looking frantically for Eddie Bracken, his closest friend. Desi looked like he had a heavy hangover, and I asked what had happened. Well, Mrs. B, he said, I eloped to Greenwich last night with Lucille Ball. I want Eddie to go with me to break the news to my mother, who will raise Cain. But you know something, Mrs. B? I think it's going to work out. I think we're going to like it in spite of the fact that we were both too drunk to know what we were doing. Which I just think is great. So if you ever want to know about their wedding, apparently they eloped. And I just think it's interesting that apparently Mrs. Bellamann knew before even his own mother. So lastly, this is where they lived. When they lived in New York City, they lived at the Ansonia Hotel. And this is on Broadway between, I believe it's between 73rd and 74th. They also lived on, I want to say 81st Street for a long time. They lived somewhere in the 80s, but I may be thinking 81st Street because, Verity, who lived at 129 West 81st Street, apartment 5A? That's right, Seinfeld, so. Another brilliant creator with kind of a troubled personal life. But anyway, So the Ansonia Hotel is where they lived, and the Ansonia Hotel was really interesting. Now it's condos, it's just called the Ansonia, but it was like a who's who of famous people living in this building. So lo and behold, how many of you, honest show of hands, first I'm gonna wreck the podium. Okay, now we're good, I think. Honest show of hands, how many of you have seen the show Only Murders in the Building? Okay, a few of you. If you have not, highly recommend. Yes, it's got Steve Martin, Martin Short, and Selena Gomez. So there's something for every generation. And basically the premise of the show is they solve murders, and they have a podcast, but they only solve murders in the building. By the way, no spoilers, because I haven't watched the last episode yet. The episode last week, I really related to, because I too have found myself in emotional arguments with cookies. And another thing is they just renewed for season 4. So this is quickly, the building they live in is quickly becoming probably the most dangerous building in New York City, let's face it. But the building they live in is called, also has celebrities everywhere. So the Steve Martin character and Martin Short characters are kind of supposed to be like B-list celebrities. Also, Meryl Streep's in the last season playing an unsuccessful actor, which I find fabulously ironic. But there are all these celebrities who live in this hotel together, just like Henry and Katherine Bellamann. And the name of the building is the Arconia. And I thought, oh boy, I bet this is the Ansonia. So of course I had to do research. And the external, as you can see, this isn't the same building, like the external view as in Only Murders in the Building. That's actually another building called the Bellhurst in Manhattan, also on the Upper West Side. But the actual building itself and the stories are very much based on the Ansonia. So I just think it's cool that Henry and Katherine Bellamann were living basically the life of Only Murders in the Building. And they had a fabulous living room that had 2 grand pianos where they would give their lessons. And the Ansonia Hotel, by the way, also was in the 1970s, was home of the Continental Baths, which is the gay bathhouse where Bette Midler got her start singing cabaret songs, and also Barry Manilow was her accompanist. So, with that being said, I want to thank you all for being here, because I really want to, again, my purpose here was just to kind of explain who these people were and talk about why their work is important today, and again, really kind of give Katherine, the further I delve into my research, I really want to give Katherine the credit I think she didn't always get. So of course I have special thanks. So my research buddies, Harry Payne, Lenny Pinna, Mike McQuistion, who is the copyright owner to Kings Row that I went on a 3-year wild goose chase to find. I can tell you more on that at another time if you want. Tricia Ullman from Hastings College Press, who helped me republish Kings Row. The students in my own class, English 3130, here at ABAC, they're my publishing class, and they worked on Pet and Air's Daughter, the covers by Delaney Garcia. They have done wonderful work, and they've had to listen to me talk about this for a long time. And just the School of Arts and Sciences, I mean, obviously, you know, Dr. Anderson, Dr. Harrison, so Dr. Anderson, my dean, Dr. Harrison, my department head, Dr. Hall, my soon-to-be department head, and basically everybody, because I feel if I'd named people, I would probably miss someone, because they're all fabulous. And also, they have probably all, at one point or another, heard me listen to me talk about the Bellamanns.